Good morning, everyone. I hope everybody's doing well. We are so close to the conclusion of this semester, which is, I think for some of you, probably very exciting, but then also a little bit intimidating because we're coming to up to our final exam where we're going to be wrapping everything up. So I stand ready and eager and interested in helping you all succeed in that, and I know that our tutor does as well. This is the last set of lectures that you're going to receive this week's, and this lecture in particular, excuse me, is going to focus on Hebrew verbal patterns, or sometimes they're called stems. Now, let's be clear about one thing. We all have been working with a single Hebrew stem, and we call it the pa'al. Let's look at it. This is the pa'al chart using the root letter shamar, one that we've encountered quite a bit. It means to guard. What's nice about using shamar is that it's regular. It doesn't cause any real problems when you put endings on it and whatnot. And so it's good here to look at this chart for a couple reasons. First is just to survey the extent of your learning, right? So let's look at these sections one at a time. We won't go into great detail. This was the very first verbal form within the stem, the pa'al stem that you learned. It's the perfect, shamarti, I guarded. And then we learned all these different forms, right? You guarded, both masculine and feminine. He guarded, she guarded. We guarded, y'all guarded. Y'all feminine guarded, and then they guarded in their different forms, and in their two forms. And so also what we have here is the two different participles. We have the active participle, the passive, the command, and the infinitive. And over this course, you have learned the entirety of this. And so one of the advantages of simply reviewing a chart like this is to see how far you've come. Now, what we're going to do in this lecture is introduce sort of the next horizon in Hebrew verbs. And it will look like this. Here are my outcomes for the day. Students will be able to recognize the pi'el, hif'il, nif'al, and hitpa'el verbal stems and patterns. This knowledge will be demonstrated by their ability to identify the third masculine, singular, perfect, and imperfect of each form. In other words, we've learned the pa'al stem. There are 7 total stems within Hebrew, and we're going to not extensively learn, but we are going to survey to the degree that you will be able to recognize these 4 additional stems. And these are the most common ones. There are others that we're leaving out. The reason we're leaving them out is because they're not that common. And you will be able to use other tools like dictionary and lexicon grammars if you come across verbs like that. So I decided to focus on, in addition to the pa'al, which we've already learned, on the 4 additional stems that are most frequently encountered in the Hebrew Bible. So they call the pi'el, the hif'il, nif'al, and hitpa'el. Let me kind of help you have the right mindset going into this lecture. You will feel overwhelmed at the end of this lecture, but keep this in mind, that my only outcome for you is that you will be able to identify the third masculine, singular, perfect, and imperfect form of each of these stems. So 2 verbs from each stem, right? Third masculine, singular, perfect. Third masculine, singular, imperfect. And why do I choose those particular ones? Because they're the ones that are most common in the Hebrew Bible. More often than not, you're going to have third-person verbs, and in both perfect and imperfect. That's why I chose it that way. So in other words, let's just boil it down. You need to learn 8 words today, right? Okay, so while you're getting this download of tons of information, just keep in mind that your goal at the end of this, and what you will be tested on, is that you will need to be able to recognize 8 different patterns. And patterns being beginnings and endings. I'll keep working to clarify that as we move along. But before we do that, let's begin by trying to define what we mean by a stem. That's what we call the Hebrew patterns or stems. And let's start with a very non-linguistic example. Okay, So to the right here, this picture, you see one of humanity's great creations, right? Tofu. And I don't know exactly how, with the chopsticks, and so I don't know how they're seasoning all of this. But one of the, on the left-hand side, so the tofu, this is for all of us who like to have a kind of meat-free or meat a reduced diet. So this is one of humanity's great creations, the tofu. To the left is one of God's creations, which is the elk tenderloin. Um, and so, for those of you, this is a slide that can be an analogy that can be approached by both meat lovers and people who eat meatless diets. In any case, what's beautiful about these two foods is that they can be cooked and seasoned and prepared in so many different ways from that base material, from that base protein material, right? You can cook it in ways that reflect different ethnic traditions, ethnic cooking traditions. You can cook them in ways that use different kinds of seasoning, but at the base of it, you're still working with tofu and meat, right? But you're sort of inflecting through ingredients the flavors based on what you add, how you prepare it, etc. Hebrew verbal stems are actually quite similar. You'll remember from our earlier conversations that all Hebrew verbs are built off of three-letter triconsonantal roots. Let's go back to our chart here. So in the case of shamar, it is built off of shin mem resh, and that's why when you're looking chapter by chapter at your vocab list, they will often list just the three letters, right, with a dot in between them. The letters never show up that way in the biblical text, but when you turn to dictionaries and lexica, they will typically, they won't. So let's just take an example. Look at this word eshmor. Let's say you found this word in a sentence and you thought, oh, I don't know what this is. What does eshmor mean? If you were to try and look this word up as it is, aleph, shin, mem, resh, you would not be able to find it. At least you would not be able to find it. You would not be able to determine that it means I will guard. You, as the Hebrew student, would have to recognize, well, the first thing I need to do is isolate the three-letter root. And so that it requires removing the prefix and recognizing that shin, mem, resh are the root letter. And what you would then do is open your dictionary up, not to aleph, shin, mem, resh, so not to the beginning, but rather to the end of the dictionary, shin, mem, resh. And there you would find an entry for shamar. and so the dictionaries themselves, just like the broader Hebrew verbal system, is organized around these three-letter roots. But depending on what consonants and especially vowels you add to that root, the different kinds of ingredients or means of cooking, whatever flavors you add to that root, will change its meaning. And so that's when we talk about different verbal stems, that's what we mean is configuring the verb, the three-letter root, in different ways, right? Back to our analogy. Adding different ingredients to the base material in order to get it to taste a certain way, sound a different way, linguistically, to have a different meaning. And so we're going to look at four different ways of four different stems, four different patterns where Hebrew will add different vowels, different consonants to those three base letters in order to get them to have a slightly different meaning, sometimes a completely different meaning. Sometimes the meaning will be vaguely, in most cases, the meaning will be vaguely related to how you know it in the Pa'al. Sometimes it will not be. It will not seem immediately to be related. In most cases it is. There's some kind of echo or relation between the two. But again, let's focus on our priority. I'm going to be throwing a lot of information at you, and your goal, what you will be evaluated on, is your ability to identify these patterns in the forms of third masculine singular, third masculine imperfect. Now, there are going to be a couple, the presentation itself is going to be a little bit jerky. I determined that the best way to do this was actually just to work my way through a couple of the pages in the textbook itself. And so I scanned those into PDFs, and we'll be transitioning among different PDFs. And so there may be a little bit of jerkiness in the presentation, but I thought this was just the most effective way to do it. The very first one we're going to look at, the first stem, is called the PAL. Let's dig into that. PDF number 1. This is all, again, all from your book. And I tried to include all the page numbers in the scans just so you can kind of follow along in your book if you want to take notes. Hebrew verbal patterns. This is just your book's own explanation of what I just said. So I'm not going to go into it in any great detail. Basically, the patterns are you take the core, the raw material, right, of the verb, which is the three-letter roots, shin, mem, resh in our earlier example, and then you add consonants and vowels in different configurations in order to change that meaning. The very first pattern or stem, the very first way of changing the verbal meaning is called the P-ale. Now notice, pa'al, this is what you know. P-ale, this is what we're learning. This word pa'al, or these three letters pa'al, this is kind of a sort of a paradigm verb of sorts. And if you listen to how these are pronounced, pa'al, P-ale, you will already begin to see that even in this paradigm verb, they're telling you how the vowels will be different. So let's just remember back to shamar. What is a third masculine singular shamar? Well, it is in fact shamar, right? Just like pa'al. Notice how it's the same vowel pattern. So let's go back to shamar, third masculine singular, shamar, right? Shamar is in the, what stem is in? It is in the, where's the ruler? It is in the pa'al. Now we're going to learn the P-ale. So these terms for the stems themselves are related to how the vowels change within that stem. So we'll read through this. When a root appears in both the pa'al and the P-ale verbal patterns, the meaning of the verb in the pa'al, that's the one that we already know, is usually different from its meaning in the P-ale. Verbal roots appearing in the pa'al usually express simple action, right? Like think of shamar, he guarded. Simple action. While the same roots appearing in the P-ale pattern often express intensification or repetition. So here they give us a couple of examples from shalach, right? Shalach in the pa'al means to send, and here we have it here, meaning in pa'al. Or if we just said shalach, it would mean he sent, right, in the perfect. Now, what does it mean in the P-ale? To send away or set free. So it's a kind of intensification of its base meaning in the pa'al. So this is just, excuse me, this is a really nice and easy way of entering into why Hebrew verbal stems are different. Instead of thinking up a completely different word for how to say set free or send away, what they do is they change the vowels instead in a way that keeps the two verbs related to one another but also slightly different. So let's look at another one, safar. Okay, so safar in the pa'al would mean to count something, right? It would have to do with counting. So if we said safar, it would mean he counted. Now what happens when it goes into the P-ale? It means he, siper. It means he recounted or he narrated. So the simple change in vowels also has a profound change on what the verb means. And so here, one last example. Shavar, shiber, smash. So shavar in the pa'al, the form that we already know, means break. In the P-ale, it means smash. Okay, so this is a good place to start because it lets us begin to see, like, why would they have these different verbal stems? Why have these different verbal patterns in the first place? It is so that they can inflect the verb, so that they can offer different, more nuanced meanings to the verbal root. Again, back to our sort of edible examples, right? With tofu and meat, you can prepare these in different ways. You can add different ingredients to them to bring out different sorts of flavors, different sorts of nuances, and that is in fact the idea with verbal stems. Is that as you add different verbs and different vowels and consonants, you give a slightly different meaning to it. So here's the question: how do we recognize the P-ale pattern? Let me actually show you, here's the model verb. So this, you could compare this is P-ale pattern with perfect, imperfect participle command. You could, and this is on page, I think it's 257. Let's see, 256. You could compare this to this, which is the pa'al, okay? And I would encourage you to do this. I'd encourage you just to either print these out or look at these, open your book and look at one and compare the two, just to see what kind of patterns you will find. So this is the entirety of the verb. We're going to go about this sort of one at a time. Now, all that you are responsible for in this lecture is remembering being able to recognize what is the third masculine singular imperfect and perfect of the PAL. So that's this form and this form. Okay, that's all that you're responsible to recognize. But I'm going to give you a whole bunch of other information that will sort of fill out your knowledge. So let's go back to this page though. How to recognize the PAL. You'll usually be able to recognize the difference between Pa'al and PAL by the dagesh in the middle root letter. So let's look at that. What do they mean by that? Okay, one of the key differences, and this is why I encourage you to kind of look back and forth at the different ones. One of the key differences between the PAL and the Pa'al is that dagesh in the second letter. Notice, look through the whole chart. It's there every time. Now, there are always going to be exceptions to this, but this is a solid rule for a regular verb that a regular verb in the PAL will have the dagesh in the second letter. So that's the dagesh in the beit, right? Let's look back at the Pa'al. Oh, not there, right? The dagesh is missing. Now, what else do you notice? What are some other kind of key indicators of the PAL? Well, think about the word PAL, right? The paradigm word PAL, and you'll notice in the perfect diber. They're the same vowels, PAL, diber. So you have another key indicator for the PAL in the perfect is the hirik underneath the first letter and the tseire underneath the beit. Diber, PAL, that kind of thing. And so now compare diber to shamar, right? So it's the vowels in the PAL the vowels and then the dagesh in the second letter that tell you, hey, you're looking at a different verbal stem and this verbal stem is PAL. So those are the two in the perfect. That's what I look for. Those are the signs that I look for that I'm looking at a perfect. So again, just to reiterate, what you're responsible for knowing in the perfect is being able to recognize that diber is a PAL verb. So a question might look like this. I might put this verb, diber, in front of you and say, here's a multiple choice question. To which verbal stem does diber belong? Does it belong to hif'il? We haven't learned that one yet. Hitpa'el? We haven't learned that one yet. Pa'al? That's the one we know. Or PAL? And then you would have to choose which of those verbal stems does diber belong to. That's it. That's what you have to be able to do. If we had a longer Hebrew class, like in the past, Luther did, it was a credit and a half, 1.5. We would spend several sessions on each of these stems, but we don't have time to do it. So what I'm trying to do is give you enough exposure that you'll be able to recognize when you're looking at a different verbal stem. You'll be able to take the verb apart in such a way that you recognize what the root letters are, and from there be able to say, oh, this is probably one of the verbal stems that I heard about when I was in Hebrew, something like that. Or when you're using, for instance, BibleWorks or Accordance, when you pull up that entry and it says, oh, well, in the Pa'al, it means this. In the PAL and Hitpa'el, it means this. That will not be the first time you hear that. So in the perfect, what I'm always usually looking for, is the hirik and the tseire under the second letter. Now, switch over to the imperfect. What I'm looking for is, again, the dagesh, just like in the perfect. And this, the patach beneath the first letter. That's where it changes, where what's common between the perfect and the imperfect is the dagesh, and in some cases the tseire underneath the beit. But that tseire isn't always there, and it's not always there in the perfect either, just in the third masculine singular. And so the key indicators in the imperfect are the patach underneath the dalet and the dagesh in the beit. Okay, those are the things you're looking for, and then sometimes the tseire, but that is inconsistently there. And so those are, let me go back to my sheet. Whoops, wrong one. There are a couple of other indicators that you may want to look at in the chapter, but those are the two that are most that I think are most significant for recognizing the P-ale. Just and notice also that when you slip over into participles and commands and infinitives, the markers there are the same markers as in the imperfect, right? You have the a vowel here, the patach, dabri, and then you have the dagesh in the second letter. So those are your telltale signs that you were looking at P-ale in both the perfect and the imperfect. What is your only job? As a reminder, is you need to be able to recognize the third masculine singular perfect and the third masculine singular imperfect, right? So you just memorize those markers. Say to yourself, is there a hirik under the first letter or a patach? Is there a dagesh in the second letter? And if the answer is yes to both of those questions, you may be looking at a P-ale verb. Okay. Now, as you can tell, there's so much more we could go into, but I wanted to just sort of reduce this down to its most common elements so that when you're reading, you might look at a word and say, you know, I know what that word looks like in the pa'al, or I've seen that those consonants before in the pa'al, but I don't recognize the vowels. Maybe at that point you'll say, maybe I'm looking at a different verbal stem. Perhaps the P-ale, perhaps the next one that we're going to look at. Now I just need to pause it for a second to transition to the next one. Okay, we just finished looking at the P-ale. Now we're going to take the next step and look at a new stem called the hif-eel. The hif-eel is going to present a new set of challenges for this reason. The P-ale only changes vowels, right? It isn't adding necessarily tons of consonants in that you need to memorize, but what the hif-eel does is it will actually add some consonants to it, to its form, and you hear that a bit even in the paradigm word hif-eel, right? If you look at the word hif-eel, you see the three root letters, pei, ayin, lamed, but then you have this hey there. What is that? What is it with Hebrew wanting to add a hey to everything? We have this in the nouns and the definite articles. Now we're finally going to have it with the verbs. So let's read this short paragraph. You have already learned two Hebrew verb patterns, the pa'al and the P-ale, right? Again, look at those paradigm words. All you're adding are vowels. That's really what's changing are the vowels. And but none of the actually, let me say this. None of the prefixes or suffixes change, right? That's why it's so helpful to learn all those prefixes and suffixes for the verbs early on, because they translate into all of these verbal stems. You never have to learn different prefixes and suffixes for the different verbal stems. All that the verbal stems do is add vowels, maybe add a consonant here and there, but the prefixes and suffixes indicating gender, number, person, that kind of thing, those will all remain the same, which is really nice. So anyways, the third pattern you will learn is the hif-eel. And based on this paradigm word, hif-eel, you can already see that this verbal pattern, at least in the perfect, is going to add this he sound and probably also this eel sound. Sometimes also the eel sound with the yod. When a root appears in the pa'al pattern, it usually has a simple active meaning. When the same root appears in the hif-eel pattern, it usually has a causative meaning, meaning cause something or someone to do something. So the following is a chart of verbal roots you have learned which appear in both pa'al and hif-eel. So that's helpful, right? They're going to show us, we're going to just look at a couple of these and see, how does putting it in the hif-eel pattern change the meaning? Let's skip bo for now. And let's go to yada. This is a verb that we learned early on. And in the pa'al, yada means he knew, right? Or has to do with knowing and whatnot. Now, what does it mean in the hif-eel? How do you cause somebody to know? That would be an interesting question. It means to cause, to know, or announce. So when you change the vowels and consonants from their pa'al configuration into their hif-eel configuration using the verbal root yada, you will be saying no longer he knew, but he caused to know, or he announced something, right? That's a verb that you might imagine in the biblical text is quite important. So let's try yalad. Yalad is a verb that means to give birth. Uh, and so in its pa'al form, Yalda, for instance, would mean she gave birth to. When you shift it over to the hif'il, it is to cause to give birth or to beget. And so again, more of that causal sense is sent out. So let's see. Let's try another one. Oh yeah, let's try the word for die. Mem vav tav. In the pa'al, this would mean he died, something like that. In the hif'il, he caused to die or he killed. You can really, I chose that one an example because you can kind of see the distinctions quite well. Now, is it always the case that that these definitions are so sort of cut and dry? One is causal, the other one is kind of simple active. No, but it does sort of communicate. In general, this is how it works when you have verbs in both stems. So in terms of meaning, the hif'il really is more about causation. In general, it's about causation. We're not going to look at all these different examples, but if you want to look at that, you can examine it later. Now, what they do in this chapter on the hif'il is they will here we go. They'll give us a model verb, and then what they're going to do is lay out the perfect, the perfect, the imperfect, and the participle. They'll put the hif'il alongside what we already know in the pa'al, so that will be really helpful. So here's just the entire verbal system for shalach, right? The word for send, but in the hif'il. So let's begin to look at a couple things. Actually, you know what? Let's, instead of looking at this whole chart, let's start with the hif'il perfect. Now, what you have here on the right is the pa'al using the verbal root malach, right, which has to do with ruling or being a king or something like that. So on the right we have the pa'al. This is the form we know, malachti, right? Most of you, all of you can translate that. I ruled. Now, what happens when you take that pa'al, when you take that verbal stem, that core verbal material, and you put it then into the hif'il? Well, pronunciation-wise, here are the additions, right? Always an outline. That's how our book helpfully does it. Him lachti, okay? Him lachti. And so you have the addition of the he at the end, which is typical for the perfect of the hif'il. But notice the endings are the same. Just like I said with the PL, these endings don't change across all the verbal stems. So even if you came across a sentence that said like himlich or something, right down here, he caused someone to rule, you might look at that and say, actually that was a bad example. Let me try this one. Himlachta. You might look at this and say, okay, well, I don't really know what the he is doing at the beginning, right here, but I sure as the sun is blue recognize what a ta is right at the end of a verb. This is a second masculine singular ending. So what's going on here? Why don't I recognize the beginning? Well, that might cue your memory to say, hey, maybe this is one of those different verbal stems, and you would be right. So the difference here, malachta, you ruled, to himlachti, himlachta, you caused to rule. So again, that's what these verbal stems are for. They're for taking that core, that raw kind of verbal material, making different consonantal and verbal additions to it in order to nuance the verb in a slightly different way. Again, as a reminder, back to our sort of our food example, you have kind of the raw material here, whether it's the tofu or the meat, and you're going to do different things to it to bring out different flavors. Maybe you're going to grill it. Maybe you're going to, I don't know, do whatever with it. You're going to do something to bring out different flavors. So the same thing can be true with the hif'il. So that we were just looking at the perfect right here. Remember, all I'm asking you to be able to recognize third masculine singular form. So you might get, here's another sample question for the final. You might see himlich here, I'll put it on the page, on the quiz, and then you'll see a multiple choice question with options like, is this verb in the, is this verb in the pa'al, hif'il, pi'el, hitpa'el, and you'll just have to tell me, this verb is a hif'il verb. Boom, done. That's all that I'm asking you to be able to do, is to recognize this third singular form in both its perfect and now imperfect forms. So here's the imperfect tense in the hif-il pattern, but compared to the pa'al. So here we have the pa'al. Let's look at let's start with the third masculine singular in this case. Pa'al, you know this, yim loch. Yod, here's your yod prefix, right? Yim loch. In the hif-il imperfect, you don't have the addition of the he. What you have is a simple shift of the vowels and the addition of a yod sometimes. But the key indicators are that you have this patach under the prefix, and that you have a yod or an e sound, the heuric sound, between the second and third letters. So for me, this is usually the first. The yod is variable. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. The e sound is often there, but what I'm often looking for is this patach at the beginning. So if I see a patach below the prefix of a verb, I am thinking hif-il. In comparison to like the pa'al, right, which is a heuric. So yimloch, pa'al, yamlich, hif-il. So those are the kinds of things you want to look for. Again, what am I asking you to be able to identify? I want you to be able to identify this third masculine singular form in the perfect, here, himlich, in the imperfect, here, yamlich. Notice again, the prefixes and suffixes are the same, right? You have a tav and a yod for a second feminine singular. You have a noon for the first common plural. Instead of nimloch, you have namlich. You have a tav and a shurech in the second persons, or a tav and a na in the second person. In the third person, you have a yod and a shurech, or in the case of a feminine, you have a tav and a na. And so again, the prefixes and the suffixes, you already know them. Really, the focus here is on learning the different vowel and consonantal configurations. So that's the hif-il, and we could look briefly at the participle too, and just compare it to the pa'al. Again, you don't have to be able to recognize this for the test. I'm just showing you. The participle in the hif-il, well, this is the pa'al, right? We already know this. Moled, molechet, molchim. We know that in the pa'al participle, you have the o here between the first, the cholam vav, between the first and the second letters. Here's what happens for the participle in the hif-il. They add a mem to the front, a mem, and a patach underneath. So mamlich, mamlechet, mamlichim, mamlichot. Okay, so that's the telltale sign of the participle in the hif-il, is the mem addition plus the patach underneath. This is a very, very strong and consistent pattern for the hif-il participle. So, and then we're not going to go into the other details again of the other versions. Again, the purpose is for you to learn the third masculine singular, imperfect, and perfect forms of each of these verbal stems. This is on page 274. Okay, let's switch over to our next verbal stem. Okay, the third verbal stem that we're going to cover today is called the nif-al. Go away. Okay, how to recognize the nif-al. Again, use these stem names as a clue. Nif-al. So as you look at nif-al, what is the most distinct aspect of this when you compare it to pa'al, hit pa'el, pi'el? It is that noon. And so, as the book says, the signal letter noon, characteristic of the nif-al pattern, appears at the beginning of each form of the perfect and the participle. Okay, so that's our major clue. And then the imperfect, the regular infinitive and the command, can be recognized by their three full distinct vowels. Read the following examples aloud and you will hear these three vowels. So the vowels here especially are the things to notice are the heuric underneath the prefix, the dagesh. Let me get it a little closer so you can see it better. The dagesh in the sheen and the comments underneath. So yishamer, and the distinguishing elements here being the e, the heuric, and then the dagesh and the comments underneath the sheen. Yishamer. So those are the things that you're going to be looking for to identify the nif all. If you're working with the perfect and the participle, the distinguishing features of the ni part, nif all. When you're looking at the imperfect and the imperative, etc., infinitive, you're looking for this vowel configuration. So let's look at don't worry about this transformer verb stuff. We're going to look at some examples. Well, let's actually look at meaning first. I'm sorry. So we're going to learn about the nif all. The nif all pattern is a passive pattern. And so we have learned some ways of doing passive, like with the passive participle. But this is an entire verbal stem that focuses on verbal stems that can be turned into passive verbs. So let's look at an example. So amar, this is a word that we've encountered quite a bit. It means, it has to do with saying something. In the Pa'al, it just means say. So amar would be he said. Now, what happens when you put it in the nif'al, nishmar? It would say to be. It means to be said. So something was said or something like that. Or asaf. This is a word that means to gather. In the pa'al, he gathered. What happens when you put it in the nif'al? Be gathered, or they were gathered. So we were gathered, you were gathered. Again, it has to do with passivity. So the nif'al is a whole stem dedicated to passive verbs. Zachar, that's a good one. So Zachar in the pa'al, the form that we already know, means he remembered or something like that. It has to do with memory. God remembered, Eve remembered, Abraham remembered, they remembered, you remembered, stuff like that. Now in the passive, were remembered or to be remembered. He was remembered, we were remembered, stuff like that. Or here's a really good one from Yalad in the Pa'al, meaning to give birth. In the Nif'al, meaning to be born, right? So you would, in English, you might say something like, Sarah, she gave birth. And then in the passive, you might say Isaac was born. that would be the passive. So the object is acted upon, right? Or the subject. I'm sorry, the subject of the verb is acted upon. He was born, something like that. So that's what we're looking at in terms of meaning. Now, sometimes the nif'al can also have a reflexive sense. We're not going to get into that so much. For now, we'll just focus on the nif'al as passive. Now, how do we recognize it? We already went over this a little bit, but in the perfect, it is this noon letter. In the imperfect, it's this special configuration of vowels, the hirik, the dagesh, and the comments. Okay, so now let's look at the model. Actually, let's look. Here's what I want to do. I want to compare. Oops, back off. We have perfect here on the right, imperfect on the left, participles, commands, infinitives, right? We've looked at this kind of term before. Let's just begin with a comparison of the third masculine singular perfect form of shamar. And then what we'll do is compare it to the third masculine singular form of shamar in the pa'al. Okay, so let's start with the pa'al. This is a verb we're very familiar with, shamar, he guarded. Okay, this is in the pa'al. What happens in the nif'al, right? In the perfect, you're going to add a noon, the ni sound. This is the third masculine singular in the nif'al, nishmar, nishmar. So what's the key here is to recognize the noon addition in the nif'al. Now, this already brings up a potential hazard, right, for us, and that is in duplicate forms. So look at nishmar. You could potentially identify this as a nif'al, but it could be identified as something else too. Can you think of what it is? What is it? What could you confuse the nif'al nishmar with? How about the imperfect, first common plural imperfect of the pa'al of shamar? We will guard. Okay, so let's look at this is shamar in the pa'al, imperfect nishmar. We will guard, but nishmar in the nif'al is he was guarded or something like that. So that's where context has to become determinative, where you have to use context just to make the decision. So that kind of stuff, in most cases, it's absolutely certain what is happening. But sometimes you just have to make an interpretive decision. So that's the perfect when we compare the perfect of shamar with the perfect of the nif'al of shamar. What we find in the perfect is the addition of this ni sound. And again, what am I asking you to do for the final? You might be given the verb nishmar, and then you would be, and I won't try and be tricky with the first common plural, but I might say, is this in the, the pi'el? Is it a hit pa'el? What is the verbal stem? And you would simply have to say, this is a nif'al verb. Simple, right? Just it's simple. And use the name of the stem nif'al to your advantage. If you see a noon in front of a perfect verb, so for instance, if I throw this verb at you, nishmarta, okay, you know that it's perfect because it has the perfect ending, right? Ta, that's an ending that you know already from shamar in the pa'al, shamarta. You would just have to say, that's a nif'al verb. That's it. That's all, we're going to stick with the thirds, but that's all that I'm asking you to do, is to be able to recognize these third masculine singular verbs in the perfect and the imperfect, that they are part of the nif'al stem. So now let's switch over to the imperfect. Yishamer. Now let's look down the line at the first two consonants. Eshamer, tishamer, tishamri. Yishamer, tishamer, and notice the consistency here in the nif'al imperfects. You're looking for the dagesh in the comments primarily. Those are your main indicators because the other stuff changes a little bit, right? In most cases it is ti or ishamer, isha, tishamer, yishamer. In most cases you're going to have that hirik, but sometimes that's not always true. That's why I think the strongest indicator is to look for the dagesh in the comments. Okay, that's the nif'al, right? And then there are other things that we could dig into deeper with the participle and with the commands, but we're not going to worry about that for now because we simply don't have time to go into that kind of detail. Just if you recognize those main features, the ni and then this combination of the dagesh and the comments, you will be well on your way to at least being able to recognize when you are looking at a nif'al verb. Okay, let's move on to our next step. Okay, people, this is our last verbal stem for the day. From chapter 29, the hit pa'el. Don't worry about this vocab. You're not responsible for it. Just need to scroll down the screen. Okay. The last verbal stem that we're going to learn, do they have it up here? Yeah, they have it in the title. Sorry. That's why I had it at the top. It's called the hit pa'el. Now, let's just look at the name of the verbal stem, hit pa'el, so that we can get some sense of what might be going on here. So, let's first begin by isolating the three-letter root, pe, ayin, lamed, right? The same model verb that we've been working with. Strip that away, and what are you left with? Well, you have, how is it different? Let's begin with that. How is it different? How is hit pa'el different from, for instance, the stem called pa'al? First of all, you have the addition of this heat at the beginning. And that sound heat, or in some cases meat, will be the prefix that distinguishes all hit pa'el verbs. The hit pa'el are actually so simple to recognize simply because of this fact that you're adding so much to the front, especially the sound eat. So that's your first indication, is that if you see this sound eat, it's sometimes in the form of heat, sometimes in the form of yeet, meat, we'll see examples later, then you are almost certainly looking at a hit pa'el verb. Now, some of the other indications would be the addition of the comment, or I'm sorry, the patach, the a sounding vowel underneath the first root letter. So hit pa in the model verb. So let's go begin with meaning. What does the hit pa'el typically? What kind of meaning is assigned to the verb as a result? The verbs that you have learned so far have either been active or passive, right? We just looked at the nif'al, and it's primarily a passive kind of form. However, another type of verb exists which is neither active nor passive, but reflexive. So just think about this verb reflexive. A reflexive verb describes action that the subject does to himself or herself. I I wash myself. I hit myself. Just think of the different things. Here they have a good example here. He praised himself. So different things where the subject is also the object. That's another way of putting it, or maybe where the subject acts upon him or herself or itself. In Hebrew, the verb pattern that most often expresses reflexivity is the hit pa'el. And this is the last verb that is covered in the book. Okay, so let's go to the how to recognize section. All right. Here are some verbs that appear in the hit pa'el that also appear in the pa'al and with their reflexive meaning. So halach, hey, we know this one, right? Halach we have all the time. Halach, he walked or he went. Walk or go is what it means in the pa'al and also in the pa'el. And sometimes the pa'al and the pa'el actually have basically the same meaning. But in any case, so in this case, so we have halach in what I meant to say. Let me back up just so it's not confusing. Is that sometimes pa'el does not have an intensifying effect. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes the definition of the pa'el. You'd think, well, that sounds like a definition that would belong to the pa'al. It's not a perfect system. It's not a science here. We're talking in sort of generalities. But let's look here at the halach in the pa'al. It means to walk or go. What does it mean when you put it in the hit pa'el? To go back and forth, to walk oneself around. So that would be how the hit pa'el configuration changes the verbal root of halach. Let's look at halal. Think of the word hallelujah, right? That's where hallelujah comes from, this verbal root, halal. So in the pa'al, it means to praise. When it's put in the hit pa'el, it means to praise oneself or to boast, right? And boast, in English, boast doesn't sound like it would be a reflexive kind of thing, but if you kind of think about it, you think, well, when you boast, you're really talking about yourself, right? If you're boasting about yourself. So has this kind of reflexive meaning. Similarly with chazak, to strengthen oneself, or from kadash, to make oneself holy or to sanctify oneself, whereas in the pa'el, it means to make something holy or to sanctify something, okay? So here you can kind of get a sense of how the hit pa'el changes these verbal roots to have more of a reflexive kind of meaning. Okay, now let's look at the model. So, as our book is wont to do, and I'm grateful for this, they highlight the things that are added, right, to the verbal root. So let's look at the perfect. Let's actually look at the form that you need to know, the forms you will need to know on the final. And that's, again, as a reiteration, only the third masculine singular form. That's all I'm asking you to be able to identify. So, let's look at third perfect. Hit paleo. So you can even hear in that how similar it sounds to hit pa'el. You have the heat, of course, at the beginning in the perfect, and then the ale at the end. The lael at the end, that vowel is going to change a lot. So I wouldn't rely so much on that. What you're really wanting to rely on is the heat in the perfect. And see, you'll see it's heat all the way down. From the first person all the way down to the third persons in the plural. So heat is your sign. And then again, the endings are all the same, right? Ti, ta, let, ah, nu, tem, ten, oo. All of those endings are the same across all the verbal stems. What you're looking for is the prefix heat. And in this case, what I'm asking you to memorize is the third masculine singular perfect, hit paleo, to be able to recognize that. Okay, now what happens in the imperfect? You still have the eat sound, or in the case of the first person, the et. But you have et paleo, tit paleo, tit pali, yit paleo, tit paleo, excuse me, nit paleo, nit palu, tit palena, sorry, that one always gets me, tit palelna, yit palu, tit palelna. Okay, so again, the telltale sign here is this eat sound at the beginning, and you will also you will typically also have the dagesh in the second letter. That can change a little bit, but the most important thing you're looking for is this eat sound, which in the imperfect gets all the prefixes that you already know, right? Noon, tavs, yods, blah blah blah. Same endings that you already know. all that you're adding is that eat sound. So, as a reminder, what you're being tested on is this third masculine singular form. I might put a question in front of you in which you see the word yit palel, and you'll have to tell me, is this nifal, pi'el, pa'al, or hit pa'el? Simple, right? You'll say, hey, eat sounds a lot like the word hit pa'el, and you would be absolutely right. And you would say that is a hit pa'el. So that's our final, the final stem that we're going to cover. As you can see, there's a lot of other stuff there that we didn't really go into the participles, but again, eat sound, that's there. With the commands, eat sound, that's there. The infinitives, eat and heat. I'm sorry, heat and heat. And so the heat pa'el is actually one of the easiest in terms of recognition, just because it's so consistent across the different stems. So let's go back to our slide. Again, I threw tons of information at you here. Tons, really, a half semester's. From my perspective, this would have been about a half semester's worth of material. But my goal is not that you will memorize all of it, right? Let me reiterate: you are not required to memorize all this stuff. My goal was to give you a kind of helicopter's eye view of this aspect of Hebrew language, and to give you enough information that when you come across one of these, you will say, okay, this must be a different verbal stem, and it looks like a P-A-L, Hifil, and Nifal, or Hit, Pa-El. And that it is for this reason why I'm really only asking you to focus on the third masculine singular perfect and imperfect of each form, because that is the most common form of the verb that you're going to find in the Bible. He did this, she did this, she will do this, she's doing this, whatever. He does this to himself, or she does this to himself, that kind of stuff. Or this was done to, or this was done to him, stuff like that. So I'm asking you to focus on third masculine singular perfect and imperfect of each form. That's it. You just have to be able to recognize to which stem those verbs belong. Okay? So I hope that's really clear. Again, I know it's a ton of information, but make sure that you're able to identify the perfect and imperfect of each of these forms. Now, the root might change a little bit, right? The root letters might change a little bit, but what matters is that you can recognize the prefixes, suffixes, and vowel configurations on each of these verbs. So, all right. If you have any questions at all, let me know. We'll have a busy week this week, I know, working in our small groups and our tutoring groups. And otherwise, if you have other questions, send me an email, send me a text, give me a call, and we will work through it. All right. Thanks, everyone.